Hey Wargamers, the Balanced Data Slate has been out for a little while now, and we are finally going to take a look at it and use some MathHammer to evaluate which units are the most efficient point-wise in the Tau Empire Codex. Now, if you're a long-term viewer of this channel, you've probably been wondering where this video has been, and the answer is that real life has just kind of gotten in the way for the past month or so, and I apologize for that. But I am back, and now we are able to finally talk about this. So, in this video, we're going to use MathHammer to evaluate different Tau units. In fact, we're going to use that tool to evaluate over 700 different possible units and loadouts. And this is just one way that we can compare those, right? MathHammer is not Warhammer. Warhammer is not MathHammer. There is far more to the game than just simple points efficiency. If that weren't the case, we could play this game on an Excel spreadsheet, but we can't, right? There's so many other things to consider: mobility, defense, utility, like auras and that sort of thing. None of that is accounted for in MathHammer. And so keep in mind, this is just a starting point, just one of many different perspectives or slices we can take of the game and look at how different units compare. Now, to do that, we're going to go through and make some assumptions. We're going to assume that vehicles are more likely to overcharge their ion weapons because of the way that ion charging works in 10th edition. We're going to assume that Melta really only is a thing for fusion blasters that have at least 18-inch range. Things that have 12-inch range, you're probably not going to really get much chance, maybe once or twice in a game, to use that Melta rule. And so we're making some assumptions about when things are being used and that sort of thing. And I'll go through and I will list the top 6 units for each of a variety of targets that I've done in multiple different videos in the past. We're using those same different targets now. These are just kind of placeholder targets, right? They are targets that have a stat line. We're considering their stat line only, not any types of special rules like, armor or contempt or anything like that that would modify their ability to take damage. We are looking just at their toughness, their save, and their number of wounds. That's all we're considering here. So let's start off with some basic infantry here with the Guardsmen and Eldari Guardian profiles. So the Guardsman is toughness 3, 5 up save, 1 wound. Again, that's the profile that we're considering. The top 6 units here are Breachers with a Fireblade. Breachers without a Fireblade also do very comparably. Strike teams with Fireblades also do well. Crisis suits with Flamers. Pathfinder teams with Ion rifles. The Tiger Shark with a Burst loadout and the Barracuda with the Burst loadout also show up here, which I think is something notable that you'll see throughout these rankings, is that the Tiger Shark and Barracuda still show up. There are big caveats to that though, right? Tiger Sharks, Barracudas are flyers. That means that they have to come in from reserves. They don't have hover, so there's no way around that. And so you do have an inherently lower chance of being able to actually deploy or use them against a particular unit, right? Like, we basically should at least discount this efficiency a little bit based on the total amount of time they're even on the board. But that's true for basically any unit, right? You're not necessarily going to have line of sight on turn 1, and so it's kind of hard to figure out how to really deal with that. And so we still just account for the Tiger Shark and Barracuda the same as every other unit, but it's worth noting that Tiger Sharks, Barracudas, because they're flyers, are going to have a little bit lower opportunity to actually use their firepower. Now, hopping over to the Guardian profile, toughness 3, 4 up save, 1 wound. Again, very similar rankings here. Breachers with a Fireblade show up again on top. That's a very common thing that you'll see, is that Breachers are amazing, especially when they have a Fireblade. That is just a ton of shots that are high power and highly effective. But again, they have that low range. And so you'll want to account for taking a Devilfish and all sorts of things like that. But Breachers, on paper, fantastic. And in my experience, in gameplay, also fantastic. Crisis suits. Crisis suits with Flamers, again, show up a lot here. Pathfinders with Ion Rifle, Strike teams with Fireblade, and then the Tiger Shark and Barracuda with Burst loadouts. So the players that we have here, the different units, are very comparable. It's just slight deviations in the ranking. I should also note that with Breachers, we're not taking into account their rerolls, right? Because we can't assume that a target is going to be on an objective or not on objective. So we're not accounting for any of that. That goes a really long way to making them even better, right? So Breachers, just again, a really solid choice on paper, and in gameplay, amazing as well. All right, moving on to some Marine infantry here, we have Primaris, toughness 4, 3 up save, 2 wounds. Again, starting off with the breachers and a fireblade. Again, that's going to be something that you see very commonly, is that breachers are just incredibly efficient, especially at the new price point of 9 points per model. They just rock your socks off. The next is Vespid, which is a notable thing. Like, Vespid are kind of perfectly designed to deal with Primaris, but they are auxiliaries, right? They don't have the same utility as Tau Empire units do, because they don't have access to For the Greater Good. And so that's something to consider as well, is like rules like that are going to augment some units and not others. Vespid are totally inert for the Greater Good, and so they're not going to get that benefit. They do have other things that way in their favor, though, like their ability to deep strike. That's huge. So Vespid here on paper, again, coming in the second slot, highly efficient against Primaris if you're able to get them in the right place at the right time. Strike teams with Fireblade come in third here. Pathfinders with Rail, again, are a really good choice here. This is something different than in the previous slide where we saw Ion Rifles being the optimal loadout. Here, Rail Rifles are the optimal loadout. Barracuda with Ion, and the Broadside showing up for the first time with the Rail Rifle and Plasma Rifle. And you'll see that throughout this ranking, is that the Broadside will always be, when it is one of the top choices, it will always be the Rail and Plasma Rifle loadout. For Sanguinary Guard, toughness 4, 2 up save, 2 wounds. Again, don't necessarily pay attention to the name of the unit here, whether or not Sanguinary Guard are a meta or a competitive choice or not. We're just looking at the profile. Breachers, Vespid, Pathfinders with Rail, Broadside with the Rail Rifle, Barracuda with Ion, and Crisis with Fusion. This is our first Fusion Crisis suit appearance, and they will make many more. So we see a lot of value here. And again, the Crisis suits in this case are assuming no Melta range. If you had Melta range, which is something you probably would have against Sanguinary Guard, because they're going to want to get up nice and close to you, then you actually get higher benefit out of this, right? So Crisis with Fusion Blaster, another good way to deal with Sanguinary Guard. Moving on to some tougher units here, we have toughness 5 units with the Orc Boy and the Tyranid Warrior. For the Orc Boy, we have Breachers with the Fireblade, Strike Team with Fireblade, Ion Pathfinders, the Burst Tiger Shark, the Burst Barracuda, and Cyclic Ion Blaster Crisis suits. Now, you'll see the Cyclic Ion Blaster show up a few times here, and it's generally going to be the most efficient choice against low wound count targets. So Orc Boys, this works out really well because it has the high strength, and it has enough AP to deal with their meager armor save, and then it's 1 damage without being overcharged. And so the Cyclic Ion Blaster does work out fairly well against the Orc Boy because it has kind of like the right profile. The thing that weighs it down is it just doesn't have the volume of fire that Breachers or Strike Teams do, especially when you include the Fireblade. So Cyclic Ion Blaster, great choice against Orc Boys. And again, we're not assuming that we're overcharging those regularly because of how vulnerable Crisis suits are to death by overcharging, right? That's going to be kind of a last resort or an opportunistic thing, and so we're not considering that as your standard MO for your loadout. So Crisis with Cyclic Ion Blaster as a standard profile is your number 6 slot for the Orc Boy. For Tyranid Warriors, toughness 5, 4 up save, 3 wounds. Breachers with Fireblade, Rail Pathfinders, Vespid show up again. Again, because of their profile, they do very well against this kind of meatier mid-level infantry. Strike Team with Fireblade, great volume of fire. Tiger Shark with Burst Cannon, and the Broadside with the Rail and Plasma Rifle again showing up here. Moving on to some light vehicles, we have the Broadside Battlesuit and the Star Weaver. These are both toughness 6. The Broadside has a 2 up save with 8 wounds. And the top choices here are kind of ironically a Broadside with a Rail Rifle and Plasma Rifle. Crisis suits with Fusion Blaster. The Taunar shows up for the first time here. Interesting choices here that Games Workshop has pointed the Forge World units to actually be fairly competitive in a lot of cases, right? The Tiger Shark, the Barracuda, they both have pretty big downsides in terms of their ability to be on the board and their durability. The Taunar is a pretty reasonable choice, right? In terms of durability, special rules, this ability to be on the board, all that. So the Taunar with the rail choice as his primary weapon shows up here as being a great choice against broadsides. Piranhas with fusion blasters show up very well here. Piranha fusion blasters are kind of a cut above the standard fusion blaster, and so it's not surprising that they show up here as a great way to deal with a relatively high toughness, good save, 8 wound model. Breachers with the Fireblade, they again just have a decent weapon with a high volume of fire. They show up. Riptides with the Ion Accelerator show up here too. So the Ion Accelerator on Riptide can be an effective way of dealing with broadsides. Plus it has good range, and the Riptide itself is fairly durable. So good choice there. For the Star Weaver, toughness 6, 4-up save, 6 wounds. We see a very similar suite of units. Breachers with the Fireblade, broadsides with the rail rifle and the plasma rifle, Crisis with fusion blaster, Tiger Shark with Ion, Barracuda with Ion, and Riptide with Ion. All really good choices against this kind of weaker vehicle. All right, and then looking at some of our tougher vehicles here, we have a Land Raider, a toughness 12, 2-up save, 16 wounds. Taunar with the rail option, just knocking it out of the park here. Storm Surge finally shows up, right? Storm Surge, where you been? Storm Surge with the blast cannon shows up as our top choice. The driver cannon and the blast cannon often have very similar efficiencies because there's so many other components to their output beyond just their primary weapon that I think the numerical differences between the blast cannon and the driver cannon kind of come out in the wash a lot of the time. So Storm Surge with the blast cannon works out well here. Broadsides with the rail and plasma, of course. Tiger Shark with the rail. Skyray shows up for the first time as well as a highly advantageous choice. Skyray is a really solid unit for multiple reasons here, but yeah, they just really do pack a punch. And then Crisis Suits with fusion blasters, again, against a Land Raider is going to do well. And if you are able to get up close to that thing, they're going to do even better than that. Lehman Russes, toughness 11, 2-up save, 13 wounds. Broadsides with the rail. Taunar with the rail. Storm Surge with the blast cannon. Again, driver cannon is about the same. Tiger Shark with the rail. Breachers with the Fireblade and the Skyray, wrapping up our top 6. So, it is worth noting here that as we get to these higher toughness targets, that the Skyray becomes more of a reliable choice, but that on the lower toughness targets, we see the broadside as an alternative also having really high utility. And so maybe the broadside is a little bit more generalist and something that you might want to consider a little bit more for a take-all-comers type list. All right, and then the last few units that we're going to evaluate here are going to be things that have invulnerable saves. Up until this point, we've totally ignored invulnerable saves. Now, invulnerable saves come into play, and that really changes the dynamic between things that have AP and things that don't. So, for Zangors, toughness 4, 6-up save, 1 wound, and a 6++. We see a similar loadout as our original slide here. Breachers, Strike Team, Pathfinders with Ion, Crisis with Flamers, Stealth Team shows up here actually as an efficient choice, which I think is amazing. Stealth teams generally don't make these lists. And then the Tiger Shark with the Burst Cannon shows up as well. Terminators, toughness 5, 2-up save, 3 wounds, and a 4++. A major step up in durability compared to the Zangor. Breachers with the Fireblade, the Vespid, Pathfinders with Rail, Broadside with Rail, Tiger Sharks with Ion, and the Crisis Suit with Plasma Rifle actually shows up here as well. Jumping up to Custodians at toughness 7, 2-up save, 4 wounds, and a 4++. Broadsides with Rail, Tiger Shark with Ion, Barracuda with Ion, Breachers with Fireblade, Riptide with Ion, and Pathfinders with Rail. Again, Breachers, Broadsides, all that makes sense. Ion cannons makes sense here too. All of this kind of makes sense for dealing with something that is a brick on the tabletop. All those weapons seem like, reasonable choices that you would take against a Custodian. Hive Tyrants, toughness 10, 2-up save, 10 wounds with a 4++. Broadsides with Rail, Breachers and the Fireblade. The Taunar, again, showing up. Tiger Shark with Rail, Pathfinders with Rail, and the Skyray shows up again as a really good choice here. Getting up to some big boys here, we have Magnus at toughness 11, 2-up save, 16 wounds, and a 4++. The Broadside with Rail, Breachers with the Fireblade, Taunar with Rail, Tiger Shark with Rail, Skyray, and Storm Surge with the Blast Cannon again. And again, the Driver Cannon performs comparably. So we're starting to see these higher toughness, big multi-wound models kind of have a similar suite of choices here. Broadside's always performing very well. breachers as an alternative just because of volume of fire. Then we get into more of our kind of more traditionally anti-tank, big models like the Taunar, the Tiger Shark, the Storm Surge, all those again kind of fitting that archetypical role of being anti-big stuff. And so the math supports that too, right? One thing to note here is that there is like the more we get into this, the bigger the difference is between the most efficient and the least efficient. So even within the top 6, we're generally talking about like a 50% reduction in efficiency between, in this case, like the Broadside and the Storm Surge. The Broadside is really just a fantastically efficient unit compared to things even on this list. Looking at the Wraith Knight, we have Toughness 12, 2-up save, 18 wounds, and a 4++. The Broadside with Rail, the Taunar with Rail, Breachers, Tiger Shark with Rail, Storm Surge, and Skyray show up here as well. All right, and the very last unit is the Imperial Knight at Toughness 12, 3-up save, 22 wounds, and a 5++. A familiar suite of characters here, the Taunar, the Broadside, the Storm Surge, the Skyray, and the Tiger Shark all performing well. The Piranha makes another return with the Fusion Blaster here. And so just having a little cadre of piranhas running around blasting knights sounds pretty fun, and I'm glad that they are our final unit that we will discuss in this video. All right, so this was actually probably the most interesting lineup that we've seen in a while. It's been, a lot of the same things showing up in previous versions of this where we've gone through and analyzed stuff, but there was a decent diversity of top performers. We saw Vespid, we saw strike teams, we even saw stealth teams, piranhas, skyrays, all of those things showed up here, where in the past they've been, less frequent attendees of the top 6 club. So, cool to see some of those things pop up. Again, there's more to consider than just their math hammer numerical efficiency, right? Stealth teams in particular have massive benefits in terms of for the greater good. So that's excellent that they both offer those benefits and make a brief appearance in our analyses here, right? It's important to remember timing. It's important to remember the duration of unit on the tabletop, right? Things that come in late to the game, like deep strikers, like flyers, they're going to have inherently lower utility than units that can be on the board the whole game. And so again, we might think about discounting them in some way if we can come up with a standard rule for how to do that. I don't think that this really is the format for that because it would require a lot of kind of like reminding you of the assumptions and things like that. So, again, we just took them at face value, assumed that everyone had equal opportunity to actually, shoot their weapons. Same thing for short range weapons. We're not accounting for range here. So even if you have a really short range weapon like a fusion blaster, you're going to have a harder time using that. And so that will reduce your realized efficiency based on how often you actually are able to shoot them. And so ideally there would be some way to discount performance by time, but we don't have that really down because it's so variable. Same thing for like special rules, again, that are, modifying the damage you take, modifying the AP, all that stuff. It's so context dependent. We're just kind of trying to do apples to apples comparisons here. In general, we see that crisis suits, broadsides, breachers are your staple units. They show up on pretty much every list here, right? They are just really high performing units, and they all perform well on paper, at least. Crisis suits, including commanders, right? Like these efficiencies, we're looking just at the crisis suits themselves, not including the commanders. Commanders also perform very well, right? They were always kind of in a pack. So when you hit a crisis suit on a list, the commander would be right above it because commanders are really efficient when they have 4 weapons. So crisis suits, commanders as a package perform very well, and I think their ranking on these lists represent that. So with fusion blasters in particular, they show up fairly often, which is a little surprising, but does make sense given how short of range fusion blasters are. You would expect that given their short range, they would have to perform well in order to compensate for that short range. But we still see like cyclic ion blasters show up. We still see plasma rifles show up even one time. So, you know, having those alternative weapons on your crisis suits, also solid choices. Flamers, of course, show up for the low toughness, low wound count models as well as a good choice. Burst cannons were shortly behind those. So, you know, really, if you're looking for your anti-infantry, your low toughness, low wound counts, flamers, burst cannons, both good choices. For your higher toughness things, fusion blasters, cyclic ion blasters, even plasma rifles can be viable options here. So that's the list. That's the analysis. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Does this make sense to you based on your experience on the tabletop? I think it does based on my games, but let's have a conversation about it. Let me know what you're using in your list. Either way, thanks for watching. I really appreciate you hanging out with me on the channel. And as always, happy wargaming. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you stuck around to this point in the video, maybe you want to join our Discord community as well. There's a link in the description below. Special thanks to all my supporters over on Patreon, but especially the folks that you see on your screen now. If you want to help make more invasive wargaming videos, consider joining our community over there as well.